All right. Outside factors like federal budgets, state budgets, WTO. You know, there's a lot of outside factors going on. Population growth is certainly happening. How have those kind of outside things impacted conservation? And Bruce, I think you had an initial thought on that.
I did. I've been watching conservation for a number of decades and trying to participate as much as I can. And what I think has been the most exciting movement in the last 20 years is we've moved away from a strategy of idled land conservation to working lands conservation, where we've buried the old soil bank program. We're revamping the CRP program, and there's a recognition that we need to have working lands conservation, not idle lands conservation. This is a seismic change in the last 20 years in the conservation and environment movement writ large. When I look in front of us, for the last 30 years in farming, I have farmed with the mindset that I was taught by my father, which was I was one surplus crop away from economic disaster. Every year I knew that somebody was going to raise more beans, more corn, or more wheat than I was, and I was going to have low prices, probably in the year I actually had a crop to harvest in South Dakota. Those days are behind us. We're in pipeline supply because of the population growth in the world into the foreseeable future. And if we're going to feed 9 billion souls on this planet, and the American farmer has a role in that, even whether we're the primary supplier or a residual supplier, we've got to increase productivity sustainably. And this is just going to revolutionize both how we do agriculture, because we're going to be talking about sustainable intensification. We're going to need to be talking about how to increase production on the very best soils, how to maybe eke out a little bit more on some of the marginal ground, and how to preserve the most fragile and do that in a way that maximizes efficiency, whether you're talking nutrients or you're talking herbicide placement or you're talking fertilizer. And this is a seismic change that we're on top of, and I don't think any of us can figure it out fully and anticipate it, but we can if we do it together.
Do you think, Bruce, that political entities are going to be helpful or not helpful in that effort?
Oh, the political entities are so far behind us right now. My primary goal is for politics not to get in the way of it. If they let those of us in agriculture and the production aspect move forward and take the sustainability efforts right now, we've got conversations going on between retailers and farmers about how to answer that, and no government agency or entities there. And quite frankly, all they can do is get in the way anyway. Yeah. So these are exciting, robust times for us if we were able to manage through them.
Sure. Brent, you and I were talking the other day. Is this a time where you want to tell that story that you told me about a couple days ago?
Yeah, and it relates to particulars that both Bill and Bruce should have much more knowledge about than me, but on an issue not related to working lands, conservation, and ag. I happen to be at a close in a Senate subcommittee hearing a year or two after the 1985 Farm Bill. So the issue, just to make sure you know that it's not a working lands issue necessarily, had to do with the Apostle Islands National Lake Shore. And I was at the time head of the Nature Conservancy in Wisconsin. We were in association with the Chippewa Band in that area. And so in the development of a statement of Congress language and policy associated with that, I had a subcommittee meeting, and at the end of it, there was Senator Bob Kasten, Senator Proxmire, Senator Bill Bradley, Senator Malcolm Wallop, and a couple of other senators. And as Bruce had pointed out a few minutes ago, there were times when Republicans and Democrats came together, and they did. So gathered together on this table. And to boil this little story into even a briefer thing, Senator Wallop from Wyoming started to tease Senator Proxmire about who was the better skinflint in protecting the U.S. taxpayer. Not related to this at all, but Wallop did congratulate the Indians and me for coming to something that didn't require any money. And he said, that's a good step. And then Wallop said to me, he said, young man, okay, it's a good thing. Okay. Cool. He said, young man, what does CRP stand for? So I rose to the bait, you know, like a trout coming up to a dry fly. God, I'm a sucker. So I said, sir, Conservation Reserve Program. And he just started to laugh and playing me for the fool that I was. And he said, no. And he said, conservation was an excuse. The driver was to protect small banks, small town banks, and farmers coming out of the kind of distress that Bruce had talked about. And my point about that is that sometimes these things come around to the benefits of working lands conservation and working lands agriculture when they come out of motivations that are not strictly pure, shall we say. Senator Wallop wanted to be reelected. He wanted to represent his constituents, and he was doing the best that he knew that he could. And then later there was more banter about, again, between them, but I took Wallop's point to heart.
Can I bring up
Please.
A couple of forces? First of all, I wanted to go back to the GPS technologies that was brought up earlier, because this is something that's happening around us. Our youth are more technologically savvy, but at the same time there are satellites both taking imagery all the time and making it possible for us to know exactly where we are at any point. These are phenomenal, give us phenomenal opportunity for being more precise. So there's precision agriculture, and we've talked about precision conservation for a long time. I'm not sure that that has really gotten inside conservation as much as it could, and hopefully the next panel will talk about sort of how it will over the next few years. But it's started to, and the technology has been developing around us and given us, you know, unbelievable potential, but I think yet unrealized potential to be more precise.
And certainly an outside factor.
Yes,
Yeah.
well, I thought, because
Yeah.
it's developing outside. But if you talk about outside factors, I think nothing can be as important as the climate. And some people might want to call it climate variability, climate change, whatever, but the climate is already starting to make a huge difference. And again, as we look forward, it certainly has to change more and more how we do conservation, how we think of conservation as the weather becomes more intensified in every way. That's a completely outside factor. I think the drought of this summer woke up many people to the fact that, you know, even in Indiana, we don't have infinite amounts of water, and we have to be cognizant of how the climate, as an outside factor, will interact. It does interact. Of course, it always has interacted with us in shaping our conservation into the future.
Sure, good and bad. Bruce Knight loves it, for example, in South Dakota, where it gives him more rain and a warmer temp. And
not this year.
not so much. Any other comments on outside factors?
Well, I'll take you back to CRP. I really think that we should be more flexible. We should release acres from CRP. The world needs food. The world needs energy. At least at the present time, we need more acres. And there's some of those acres that can come out. There's some of those acres that should be extended for many, many years. But we need that. It should come out with rules. I mean, it should come out with rules that, for instance, that you have to farm it to tea so that there isn't a soil loss, there isn't an environmental problem. But folks, I think it's, I'll get real strong here, it's almost sinful, as much as we need food in this world, that we have some land parked that should be utilized.
Okay. Let's move on. And Steve, I think you had a thought on this to lead off with, as far as the most single significant conservation achievement that's occurred over the last 30 years.
Sure.
And why do you think that achievement is so significant?
You're right, Neil, and I have more than a thought, so and I mentioned that.
Oh, wow.
Yeah,
Great.
so I appreciate the, I said I'd be quiet on some of the others so I could have some more time, but I want to tell a story.
All right.
I'd like to tell a story if everybody would indulge me, and And part of the story will tie back to my home state, where you're at here in Missouri. But it also ties to, at the end of the story, I'm going to tie it back strongly to CTIC and what you've done here and back at the beginning of CTIC and how everything got started. So indulge me if you would, but I'd like to tell a story. And part of the story, I have to, for the record, give credit to a couple of people. I talked to Jim Gulliford with the Soil and Water Conservation Society. Jim and I are longtime friends. He actually was at the Iowa department when I was at DNR in Missouri back in the 80s. We kind of had similar jobs. Jim went on to do great things with EPA and other things, and I just motored along. But I have to give a shout out to Jim and some of the conversation I had with him. But what I wanted to, the story I wanted to tell is, in talking to Jim and some others, and agree that, you know, no-till, conservation till, those are some of the biggest contributors to conservation we've had. And if we looked at, you know, why is that and why has that come about, we have to take a strong look at the 85 Farm Bill and the conservation title and what the role that it played to bring that about. And so at the national level, now in the state level in Missouri, back in the 80s, and all this I'm talking about is going to be back in the 80s, we had a big effort here in Missouri. Some of you might have heard of the Parks and Soil Sales Tax that actually funded the program here in Missouri. Brings in about $40–50 million a year. In Missouri, we have a lot of highly erodible land. We have a lot of high sloping land. And even with conservation till, no-till, having the ability to have terraces, and terraces cost money. A lot of money went to building terraces and stuff. So I got to hurry up here, Neil. You're going to kick me off the stage because I'm going to take too much time.
No, you're too tough.
Okay. But for Missouri, the kind of the founding father of our sales tax, a gentleman by the name of Merle Doty. He's a farmer in north central Missouri. And Merle was also very instrumental. He was the president of the National Association of Conservation Districts back in the early 80s. And Merle wrote a kind of a history of those times back in the 80s. So really quickly, I'm going to plow through this because I think it's really interesting. And it'll tie the state, the federal, and CTIC all together. And kind of, for me, I always think it's interesting to think about how a conversation you have here and there now, what effect that has 30 years from now. You know, you'd like to think what you're doing now makes a difference. And I think this really kind of ties that together. So this is from Merle Doty, back when he was at NACD. He was in D.C. at the time, back in the early 80s, as president of NACD in congressional hearings talking about soil and water. He said, we were holding the spring board meeting in NACD in D.C., and Neil Sampson, from the executive director of NADC, came to me and asked me if I knew Peter Myers from Missouri. I said I told him I did, and that he said there was a rumor he was going to be chief of Soil Conservation Service, another chief. Peter would probably like to be here. Neil asked me if John Block and Peter Myers had any connection. Yes, I said, they are good friends, and Peter had lobbied with Farm Bureau to get John Block appointed Secretary of Ag. Merle said, I thought, oh brother, Reagan is trying to downsize SCS. It's a really interesting read. I would recommend it. I had a fun time reading all this. They asked me to give Peter a call to find out if the rumors were true. I did, and Peter was running a tractor in the field at the time. So this is the early 80s, and Peter Meyer had a phone in his tractor at that time. I told Peter there was a rumor circulating out here that he was coming to Washington, D.C. to hit up SCS. He said yes, he was. I told him I thought he was going to step into a hornet's nest. I know it wasn't easy for Peter to maneuver between the administration and conservation needs of America. Peter did a good job, as anyone could have done in the circumstances. Peter and Merle knew each other. Now I want to jump ahead a little bit. So the history is, you know, he became chief and was involved in the early 80s in some of the crucial steps of putting together the Farm Bill and the conservation compliance. What I have here is a speech from Peter Myers from July of '83, and I'm proud of these guys. These are Missouri guys, so I have to admit that for a fact. But this is a speech he gave in '83 to the Southern Conservation Tillage Conference for sustainable ag, and it was on conservation tillage. And he starts out by saying conservation tillage is a key feature of the National Conservation Program, a fresh approach to USDA's Conservation Assistance Program that President Reagan sent to Congress last December. He continues expounding the benefits of conservation tillage, cost effectiveness, and this is, I can't take credit, but he talks a lot about how this was possible through weed control. So that wasn't my idea. I have to admit, I thought of that having read this. But at the very end, I'm at the end here, I want to read this, being while we're here today. At the end of the speech, he says this. He says, conservation districts and their National Association Conservation Districts, again, having been friends with Peter, with Merle and the president of NACD. He said, conservation districts and NACD deserve a great deal of credit for their leadership in promoting conservation tillage, and particularly for helping create the Conservation Tillage Information Center, CTIC, in cooperation with the agribusiness community and USDA. CTIC is gathering and spreading information that will encourage a better understanding and more effective use of conservation tillage on American farms. A monthly newsletter already is being issued. Other parts of CTIC's information network will include literature and research reviews, speaker bureau, demonstration projects, telephone referrals, liaison with industry partnerships, liaison with industry, government agencies, university, organizations, associations, farm groups, and individual districts. I thought that was really keen, Neil, and I just liked how all that tied together. And I just wondered, those guys, 30 years ago had any idea how all that was going to play. So I appreciate your indulgence and letting me do all that.
Great story. Dick Fell, you probably remember some of that.
I would just like to comment that Peter Myers was a real champion, and he worked with Jim and I and the other people. And John Block, I used to walk down the street with him and tell him about CTIC and what we're trying to do in that, and he was supportive. So those two men were very critical in the beginning and the growth of this organization.
Great.
If I just one more step through, so taking that story from there, and then so Peter Myers came back and repaid the favor. Probably got a lot of Farm Bureau friends in the room here, but at the state, the sales tax that is going to bring in $50 million to state sales tax was a tough issue for Farm Bureau. Peter Myers came back when we were having that debate. He came back to the state convention for Missouri Farm Bureau, gave the keynote address, a speech that mentioned the importance of having that. I'd give him a lot of credit for making that possible and bringing all that conservation to Missouri. Yep.
Well, let's go down the line. Bill, what's the most single?
Well, I'm going to comment. I was friends of both Peter and Jack Block. I was able to really work with Peter and talk him into no-till. Never did Block. His land was too flat, black, and good. You expect me to talk about conservation tillage or no-till. However, let's look at the big picture. Look at the achievements of the conservation system, much of which you talk about, both at the federal, state, local, and more importantly, the private level. It's continued to develop and instill a conservation ethic that's the model and the envy all around the world. Look at the soil classification system. Look at our mapping technology, really, that was built the foundation for the precision ag that we have today. Drainage design, waterways, ponds, levees, I could go on and on. But it's our voluntary approach that really gets conservation on the land, largely without regulations, at low cost to our customers, and I think at a fair cost to the public. We've developed and taught soil conservation principles at the very beginning, little simple things like we first learned. Rain must fall on residue, not on bare soil. Don't let water run off, walk it off. Take some of you old timers in here to remember these things that, farm the best, conserve or preserve the rest. Leave it better than you found it. Of course, it works in all walks of life. And a Mosley principle that I was looking through my notes last night, Jim, and we're not supposed to be talking about policy here, but Jim's policy and approach was reward the best and motivate the rest. I think we should be very proud of our achievement.
Fantastic, thank you. Bruce. Top that.
This is a tough one. I can't top that. I'm not going to try to top that. It's going to be the things like we've been talking about, the no-till, the degree to which we've largely abated soil conservation. Still work to be done out there. But the gains we've made in water conservation, still work to be done there and all that. I'm going to take this opportunity to talk about a more personal, significant thing in the last 30 years as pertains to conservation. This gentleman to the left of me was chief of NRCS and taught a young congressional staffer or a young lobbyist, I can't remember exactly where I was at the time, that it was okay to be a Republican and to be an ardent conservationist. And it was Chief Richard's mentorship for me that turned me into a conservationist, beyond just the practice on the farm, but to what I can do in a broader level. And so that's a personal story for me, which doesn't quite fit, but I got to plug it in someplace. But it also talks about how important those thousands and thousands of personal conservation stories and mentorships are. Because what has been successful over the decades about conservation partnership has in fact been that one-on-one partnership, whether it's one farmer taking another under wing and teaching them about no-till, or some consultant telling everybody in the world that'll listen to him about cover crops, or a individual out there working on those things. That sort of mentorship is what has really been a key to making conservation partnerships work over the last 30 years.
Brent?
Stepping outside of those wonderful and necessary stories, I think there are a couple of other things that would jump out at me as being conservation achievements, not perhaps the most significant, but help to set a stage of understanding of opportunities for partnerships, for collaborations, for getting across the barriers between party lines. And I'll just briefly mention two, but I'll say that if you read the headlines of 1982 and thereabouts, and I did some sampling of that, acid rain featured prominently. There was still significant coverage of point source water discharge, water pollution issues. Those have, to a large degree, thanks to the generosity of the American people and the leadership of many people, Republicans and Democrats in the political sector, left the headlines because they have been not solved, but to a large degree appropriately managed, and are coming around to be less and less of requiring our attention at time.